Good afternoon, everyone. On this July 19th, I have to start by first saying congratulations to our first wave of confirmandi and first communicants. We've broken up our classes for the sacraments into smaller groups, so we are now starting that wave of celebrating confirmation and first communion with our young people. We had our first class of confirmation this past Friday and Saturday morning, our first group of first communicants, and so congratulations to them, and we give thanks to God for His grace working in their lives. We will be continuing to celebrate with them through August. Secondly, I have to apologize that I didn't put out a video last week. Some things came up, but I'm trying to make up for that today with today's video. Last week I playfully called it Good Farmer Sunday, kind of in contrast to Good Shepherd Sunday, because all of the messages were very agricultural, but we're still on that theme today. So maybe I will fold in a few of my thoughts from last week today as we celebrate this 16th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And we open with this gospel reading, which comes from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 13. Jesus proposed another parable to the crowds, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a man who sowed good seed in his field. While everyone was asleep, his enemy came and sowed weeds all through the wheat, and then went off. When the crop grew and bore fruit, the weeds appeared as well. The slaves of the householder came to him and said, 'Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? Where have the weeds come from?' He answered, 'An enemy has done this.' His slaves said to him, 'Do you want us to go and pull them up?' He replied, 'No. If you pull up the weeds, you might uproot the wheat along with them. Let them grow together until harvest. Then at harvest time, I will say to the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles for burning, but gather the wheat into my barn.' He proposed another parable to them. 'The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a person took and sowed in a field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, yet when full grown, it is the largest of plants. It becomes a large bush, and the birds of the sky come and dwell in its branches.' He spoke to them another parable. 'The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a man took and mixed with 3 measures of wheat flour until the whole batch was leavened.' All these things Jesus spoke to the crowds in parables. He spoke to them only in parables to fulfill what had been said through the prophet, 'I will open my mouth in parables. I will announce what has lain hidden from the foundation of the world.' Then, dismissing the crowds, he went into the house. His disciples approached him and said, 'Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field.' He said in reply, 'He who sows good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed, the children of the kingdom. The weeds are the children of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. Just as weeds are collected and burned up with fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels, and they will collect out of his kingdom all who cause others to sin and all evildoers. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be wailing and grinding of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears ought to hear.'" So this is one of those classic agricultural tales of the weeds and the wheat. And every time I hear that particular parable, there are 2 events from my life that come to mind for me. One is a very common one because I think it is now part of the national curriculum in our elementary school education program, but probably all of you at some point in a science class, as you study nature and how life comes to be, have had the experience of being given seeds of some kind by your teacher, and then you put a little topsoil in a styrofoam cup or an egg carton and steadily water them and watch as these plants break through the soil. I did that as a kid, and I remember the thing that I planted in a styrofoam cup was a corn seed, and when it started breaking through, my brother Brian, uh, he would tease me from time to time. He said, "It's quack grass. It just looks like grass. It's a weed that you're growing." And I said, "No, it's corn. I planted it myself. I put the corn in there. I know what the seed is." And he said, "No, it's quack grass." And we went back and forth. The plant never got big enough to produce fruit. So I don't think the debate was ever resolved as a kid. I think right to the very end, my brother was convinced that I was growing a weed, and he was laughing at me as I carefully watered it. Uh, for some reason, that is tied a bit to this parable and the challenge of trying to identify what is a weed and what is a good plant while it's still in its infant stage. When they are small, they look the same. It's really ultimately speaking of discernment of spirits, and even more largely as a theme, it speaks of the mercy of God in this time that we've been given in this world, because we're the plants. At times we're kind of weedy, and at times we can produce good. God gives us the time to morph into what it is we're going to be until harvest time comes. So until the harvest, this is the time of mercy. But that little plant for me is forever linked to this parable. The other event that I think of has to do with a summer job that I held for multiple years growing up in middle school and early high school. I was a field roger. I grew up in Mission Valley area in Montana, an agricultural area, and I worked for a farmer who produced crops to sell the seed, because the seed apparently brings a higher profit than actually selling the produce. So this family produced potatoes and also certain types of grains. And the idea was that in order to get that top price, just before harvest time, they would have to invite a field certifier to come in, carefully walk through the fields, and grade the field to determine how pure it was, like how free of weeds, essentially. Because when you go through with the combine and harvest the crop, they have to be sure that the seed that you're selling is actually what you are presenting it to be. And so in preparation for this certification that takes place, field workers called rogers, and I was one of these, they walk through the fields. It is a kind of a skill that is not easy for all people to do. And in fact, over the years, I frequently saw people getting fired who didn't do a good job with this because so much money was riding on the line. It was a very early morning type of job. You couldn't do it at all hours of the day because your eyes had to really be keen. So we would come up just at sunrise when the sun was not so bright, but the field was also full of dew, so you would quickly get soaked to the skin as you walk through these fields. And you would walk the length of the field in about 20-foot swaths, looking on the horizon, scanning, kind of squatting down from time to time and scanning over the field, and anything that was not the correct plant had to be pulled out. So you would go through with gunny sacks, and one particular field that came to mind to me, I think it was a barley field, and you'd have to go through and recognize the difference between 6-row barley and 12-row barley and wheat and wild oats and other plants, and you just had to carefully work through and pull these incorrect plants, many of which were probably growing back from a previous year's planting, so that when the certifier arrived, it would get a passing grade. It was kind of slow work that required careful observation. That, for me, is a part of this tale. Discernment of spirits, trying to understand what kind of plant you're looking at. You really don't know until the seed head comes on the top of the plant. Then they can be distinguishable. Otherwise, just looking at the leaves and the stalks, they all kind of look very similar, and it would be easy to miss How does that apply to our life today? Well, there are two ways. One, I just look at the riots, the anarchy that's happening in our streets across America. Uh, this is the weeds in the wheat, and if you look closely, Scripture advises us that by their fruit you will know them. But sometimes, just as with plants, it takes careful observation. It takes patience to see what kind of fruit people are producing. Once you start to see the signs of evil, you can understand what we're dealing with. Um, we're assured in many places, especially in John's writing, that the one who says they love God but does not keep his commandments is a liar. But the one who lives their life in love and keeps God's ways, this is the one who knows him. This is the good plant. And we can be deceived by the enemy, Satan, who is a liar, who's a mimic from the start. For short periods of time, evil can mimic good, but never in the end does it last. If you're patient enough, you can see the fruits of the evil creep in. One example of that is with the riots happening in our own state here in Oregon, in Portland. It's a war zone. It's almost 2 months of essentially war every night. I saw a very compelling interview. The most interesting thing I saw this week, a black police officer, and he was facing off against these rioting crowds who attempt to destroy property, burn buildings, create graffiti, carry out acts of violence, especially against police officers. And he said that because they were purporting to be promoters of racial justice and equality, he, as a black man, he said, I want to engage in dialogue with the other side here. Maybe we can see some resolution. So he would come up to the fence from time to time when people would ask him to give his opinion. People asked, why are you, as a black man, on the side of the police in this situation? So he would come forward, and he said he would try to share his thinking. Why, without law and order, without law enforcement, it is usually minority communities that suffer the most. And he would begin to talk, and he said invariably it would be somebody from the other side of the crowd who would come and say, you can't talk to these people, don't talk to these people. And he said, ironically, they were almost always white people, by the way. They were young, white, leftist, privileged college students. And at one particular time, he was talking to a young black woman on the other side of the fence, telling his story. And he said something like 23 times I have tried to engage in dialogue tonight, and every time someone comes forward and tells someone from your side that we can't talk. And while he was saying this, it happened. And the young woman turned in surprise and shock to this leader from the mob and saying, he just told me this was going to happen. And it happened. You can see bad fruit in that kind of behavior. And this police officer went on to say, at some point in the violence, he looked down the police line and he said, I see more minorities, I see more black people on the side of the police serving as officers in uniform than I see in the rioting crowd. And he said, I've never heard the kind of racist attacks that I've been verbally abused with during the time of these riots here. It shows the hypocrisy of the mob, those who say they stand for black lives and for equal rights and for racial justice, who themselves are acting in a racist fashion and in a violent fashion, and certainly not in a loving way. It's an example. There are many examples like that, but don't be deceived by the words. By their fruit you will know them. And eventually there will be a harvest. My hope, and really ultimately I think the message of the gospel, is that we can change. While we are alive, we can come to the light. We can be converted. I would guess, as a betting man, that this young black woman who had that conversation with a police officer, and after seeing the hypocrisy of the leaders of her own group, I have a feeling she will no longer be a member of that mob. One by one, we win people over. We point out that trying to bring about change through violence and intimidation is not right. It's ungodly, it's uncharitable, uh, and eventually there will be judgment in all of this. We need to pray for our country, but we give thanks that we have a God who's patient, who, when his servants said, "Shall we just pull everything up?" He said, "No, because in attempting to pull out the weeds, you might pull up good plants as well. Let's wait until the final harvest." I am most grateful for this because in my life there have been many times, especially in my 20s and part of my teenage years, where I was very weedy. I was not living the right life. And if my life had been cut short and ended there, I hesitate to even think about or imagine what that might have been like, the fate of that. Thankfully, God has given me time to change. I'm still working on it, but I'm trying to be productive. I'm trying to produce good fruit. And I think people of our faith community likewise are in that camp. When we see people, however, who are on the wrong path, we can't remain silent. I think we need to help them to come to the light. We need to call upon the strength of the Holy Spirit that emboldens us, that gives us courage to speak out when we see the lies and the violence of the enemy at work, and try to preserve what is good and holy and beautiful. I invite you to help me in that endeavor, first of all, by praying for our nation in this time of need. But secondly, when we see injustice, when we hear lies uttered, not to remain silent, not to stand by and do nothing, but to take a stand. Evil will never recede on its own. Deacon Ron reminded me of that today. Given a chance, evil is never going to surrender on its own. It has to be combated. And that's what spiritual warfare is all about. God bless you this week. Stay strong in the Spirit and use this time that God has given us in our life wisely to produce good fruit.